There you go. All right, now that's a fish. That is some kind of fine trout, and that's a wild trout too. The old wild brown. That's about 20 inches. The net opening is 18. There you go. Thank you, my friend, you gorgeous creature. Well, that was certainly fun, but it's always fun for me. I always enjoy my fly fishing. I'm Phil Gay. I'm a Master Certified Casting Instructor. I would like to help you enjoy your fly fishing more by becoming a better fly caster. We're going to teach you some of the basic principles and mechanics of good casting, and after that, it's up to you to get out there and practice. Before we get into principles and mechanics, let's just review a little bit of terminology. The first is arc, rod arc versus rod stroke. Arc implies that maybe the center point of the cast is either your wrist or your elbow, and I really don't like that. I want to use the term rod stroke. It's an active verb. That means that we're stroking the fly rod from here to here. So we're going to use the term stroke versus arc. The second term that I want to talk about are stops. When we stroke the fly rod, at the end of our stroke, we're going to stop the rod and stop it firmly. Stop here and stop here. As opposed to this, which is not a stop, it just means we stop going in that direction and start going in this direction. We really need to stop, pause, pause. And we'll get into the reasons for the pause a little bit later. Stop and pause, stop and pause. The next term we want to talk about is rod loading. Rod loading is simply establishing a bend in the fly rod by accelerating the rod away from this long skinny weight, which is our fly line. And as we bring the rod forward in our casting stroke and then stop the rod, the loaded rod then throws the fly line, just like that. So when we talk about loading, we're talking about getting a bend in the fly rod. You also hear this term loop, and the loop is when we make a cast, as we stop the fly rod, this line comes off the front of the rod, and this is our loop right here. When we stop the rod, the loop is forming right off of the rod tip. If you're casting properly, your back cast loop and your forward cast loop should essentially look the same. You'll also hear the term narrow loops, wide loops, and tailing loops. And what we're talking about here, this is a narrow loop. The top part of the loop and the bottom part of the loop separated by 18 inches to 2 feet, 2.5 feet. That's a good loop. It's about like that. Tight loops are important for accuracy in dry fly presentation. They're also important for distance casting. There's times when we're working a big heavy weighted fly where we might want a wider loop. And what I mean by a wide loop is this right here. It avoids any collision between the weighted flies and the fly line. Now we have this little animal, nasty little guy called the tailing loop, which is the nemesis of most beginning fly fishermen. And what we mean by a tailing loop is the top part of the loop is going to fall down and cross below the bottom part of the loop. And it looks like that. When you have a fly on there and this loop comes up, it almost invariably ends up in a knot, just like that, you know. In fly casting, there are some basic principles that we need to understand to be good casters. I believe there are 4 basic principles that you need to understand. The first principle is that there's a relationship between how much line we're trying to cast and how long our casting stroke needs to be. A short cast requires a short casting stroke. and a longer cast requires a longer stroke. It's as simple as that. The second principle is that regardless of the length of the casting stroke, whether it be short or long, the stroke is executed the same way. It starts slow and ends fast, an accelerating stroke. Slow to fast and slow to fast, slow to fast, slow to fast. Back cast and the forward cast are the same. The third principle is that when we're doing this stroke and making this stop here, we need to pause. On a short cast, you need a very short pause. On a longer cast, you need a longer pause because it takes time for this longer amount of line to get extended out behind or out in front of the fly rod. Okay, that's principle number 3. The fourth principle is that we must move our hand in one plane. Now the vertical plane is the easiest to visualize here. If we move our hand in one plane, then the rod tip is moving in one plane. So here's the vertical plane. If I can move this over to the side, here I'm casting at 45 degrees, or if I'm casting it way down here at 90 degrees, I'm still moving my hand in one plane, which makes the rod tip go through one plane. So it's very important that the rod tip travel in a straight line. You can only do that if you move your hand in one plane. That's the fourth principle. Before we start casting, exercising our principles, let's talk about a couple of mechanics. The first is, how do we hold this thing? If you'll just pick this rod up like you'd pick up a screwdriver, this finger opposing that finger, your thumb and your forefinger opposing like that, the rest of the fingers opened up, sometimes called a key grip. If you were going to work with a key, you'd do that. But pick it up just like you'd hold a screwdriver, open fingers, and looking from this side, little gap right here, and the grip of the rod up against the heel of your hand, right here like this. You know, not up here like this, up against the heel of the hand, little gap, thumb and forefinger opposing. The next mechanic is how we integrate the upper arm, lower arm, and the hand-wrist combination in our casting stroke. First of all, with the wrist, we only want to use our wrist in this axis here. We don't want to use our wrist in this axis if we can avoid doing that. So wrist in this axis only, and wrist really only from here to here, which is wrist slightly pressed forward to here. Now you can cast with no wrist. In my particular casting style, I like to use a little bit of wrist, and the rest is arm, upper arm, and lower arm. So what this looks like from the side, you know, with the rod in my hand, is I start my cast with my wrist slightly closed down like that. I'm going to come back with my forearm, and the wrist is going to start to break, and then everything's going to stop together. Opposite coming forward. My elbow starts to drop a little bit, and the wrist closes, and the arm motion stop together. It's very important that the wrist break motion and the arm motion stop together, just like that. Now we're casting in the vertical here. That's just so you can see the good angles. We can do the same thing here from the side or even down here. The casting stroke remains the same regardless of what angle you're casting the rod. So it's an integrated motion of the upper arm, lower arm, and hand wrist. The elbow needs to be free to move side to side or up and down, depending on what angle we're casting. Looks just like that. All right, now let's take a look at the principles with the fly rod. And we'll go back through each of the 4 principles that we discussed earlier. Remember, the first is the length of our casting stroke is a function of how much line we're casting. Now, we do a lot of fishing at 10 or 12 feet of fly line out, especially for trout fishermen. So that's about what I have out there right now. So here we are, short cast, short stroke. You can still see that all the parts of my arm are contributing here, just like we talked about earlier. But the casting stroke is very short. Now if we lengthen our line in our cast, we have to lengthen our casting stroke. So let me move it out to maybe 30 feet here, which is probably the far end of the range for most trout fishing situations. Just to make a point, I cannot make this length cast with that little short casting stroke I had before. So what, see? With that length stroke, we can't energize that much fly line. So we need a longer casting stroke to energize that much fly line. So here's how much longer that stroke is, and that moved us from about a 10 or 12 foot cast out to about a 30-foot cast. Okay, just to review that first principle, short cast, short stroke, longer cast, longer stroke. Now the second principle, remember, is we move the rod slow to fast. Regardless of the length of the casting stroke, the stroke is always slow to fast. So here's our nice slow to fast stroke. Slow, faster, fast, stop. Slow, faster, fast, stop. Slow to fast, stop. Slow to fast, stop. Slow to fast, stop. Slow to fast, stop. Back cast and the forward cast are the same. All movements of the rod, slow to fast, stop. When you practice, this is easy to do. Just go slow, 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 very fast, stop. And you'll get a perfectly good back cast. Slow, 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 fast, stop. Slow, 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 fast, stop. You can see the stroke is always accelerating right to the very end. Just to review, principle number 2 is all movements of the rod start slow and end fast, regardless of the length of the casting stroke. All right, the third principle has to do with how long we need to pause when we make our stops during the casting stroke. A short cast requires a short pause, and a longer cast requires a longer pause. It looks like this, boom, 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 boom. And then with the rod, you'll see it like this. Okay. So here we are with the rod. Here's our little 10 or 12 foot cast again. Doesn't take much of a pause, but you still should get a little pause in here. So here we go. Now I am pausing there, but it doesn't take much to get the line because it's so short. It doesn't take very long for it to get back or out in front of the rod. So the pause doesn't have to be very long. Avoid doing this. Unfortunately, you can get away with this on little short casts, but you can't on longer casts. When you're learning to do this, get the pause in there, even on the shortest of casts. Okay. Now our longer cast, here's our 30-foot cast. You can just see that the pause is measurably longer at that length. And on this cast, you can't get away with this, or this is what happens. You get the collapse cast. So reviewing principle number 3, short cast, short pause, longer cast, longer pause. You can combine principles 1 and 3 into 12 words, and you'll have half of casting principles in one quick sentence. Short cast, short stroke, short pause, longer cast, longer stroke, longer pause. The fourth principle is that we must move our hand in one plane so that our rod tip travels in one plane. Now the vertical plane is the easiest one to visualize. Remember we did this earlier. Here are casting in the vertical plane. My hand's moving in one plane, therefore my rod tip will move in one plane. And what that looks like is this right here. Now the error that people make is that they sweep the rod back through a circular path, somewhat like this. And you can see the loop gets distorted out to the side. If you're casting properly, I'm moving my hand in one plane, and the top part of my loop stays directly above the bottom part of my loop. If I move over here to 45, then my top part of my loop is 45 degrees off of the bottom part. Down here at 90 degrees, the same thing. Top part of my loop is 90 degrees off of the bottom part. And if I need to move over to my other side because the wind's blowing down onto my casting shoulder, or I have trees on my right side, I just move my hand in 45 degrees off of my left shoulder. So reviewing principle number 4, you must move your hand in a single plane as you're moving it back and forth through the casting stroke. That ensures that the rod tip travels in a straight line. Now there's a horizontal plane as well. If we're doing our mechanics properly, if I'm working down toward the target here, like that, I got a fish that I'm looking right at there. If I'm working down toward him there, look where my back cast is. It's up 180 degrees out. I got a straight line from the target back to my back cast. Now if we're casting level, a medium distance cast, or for some reason we want to work level, you can see that the forward cast and the back cast again are in plane. And when we're making long casts, we tend to send the fly line uphill in front, so our back cast is actually a little bit low behind us, just like that. They're a little bit lower behind and a little bit higher in the front. All right, let's talk about a basic practice session that folds in the 4 principles we just talked about. First thing to do to get ready to practice, put a little piece of yarn on the end of your leader so that you got something you can visually track. And also put out our target. I've got a target out there at about 25 feet, and we'll use that as our aim point. Now the practice drill I want you to work on is called a pick up and lay down drill. It has 4 parts to it. The first part is we just sort of lift the rod to about here. We do our back cast, we do our forward cast, and then we bring the rod down. Now there's no stop between the lift portion and the back cast, the forward cast, and lowering the rod. But there's also no energy in this lift part or this lowering part. The energy is only in the back cast and the forward cast. And here's what it looks like, with the fly rod. I picked up a little bit of an open stance. I'm going to carry the rod just a little bit off the vertical. And we want to start with no slack underneath the fly rod. That's very important. We can't cast if we have a bunch of slack laying here on the grass or on the water. Remember, the first part of the pick up and lay down drill is the lift, and it comes to about here. Now we wouldn't normally stop here, but that's step 1. That's called the lift. There's the back cast, there's the forward cast, and then we lower the rod. We lower the rod as the line is going out toward the target. In real time, it looks like this. Lift, back cast, forward cast, and down. Lift, back cast, forward cast, and down. Lift, back cast, forward cast, down. Lift, back cast, forward cast, and down. And that's all your first practice session needs to be. Make it about 20 minutes. There's no prize for the maximum number of pick up and lay downs in any one practice session. So about 20 minutes, work at about 25 feet, and that's all you need to do. I'd like to talk a little now about false casting, which is simply moving the rod back and forth and not allowing the fly to land on the water. Now it has a purpose. Sometimes we want a false cast to dry our fly, sometimes we want a false cast to feed out line, and sometimes we want a false cast to kind of get a sense of what the wind's doing to our fly at the end of the presentation. So false casting is simply moving the rod back and forth, keeping the fly in the air, establishing a nice rhythm. It's very good for practice. It allows you to develop a sense of rhythm with your casting. And if the back cast and the forward cast feel the same and the loop size is the same, then it's valuable for you. And you want to false cast in such a way that you can watch both your back cast and your forward cast. Now let's take a look at what false casting looks like with the rod. Once again, we start with the rod tip down, go right into a back cast and then a forward cast, but now we keep the line moving. We don't let it sit down like we did with the pick up and lay down drill. Here we are moving the rod back and forth. The energy, the rhythm going back is the same as the energy and the rhythm coming forward. The loop in the back looks like the loop in the front. And you see I've kind of brought the rod down to my side so I can look at my back cast without having to roll my shoulder out of the way. because if I roll my shoulder out of the way and look at my back cast, it ruins the back cast. So this is a good little training session for you. It allows you to develop the rhythm and the sense of your casting. So how do I get this nice narrow loop like this? It's so important for accuracy and distance casting. And how do I get this wide loop when I want it? And how do I avoid this little ugly guy right here, this tailing loop, which once again did exactly what we said it would do. All right, what we're talking about here, at some point, this final acceleration of the rod, call it the power stroke, call it whatever you want, however long this power stroke speed up and stop is, that determines your loop size. If you speed up and stop over a very short period of time, you get a tight loop. If you accelerate and power through the whole casting stroke, you get a very wide loop. And if you do your accelerations in the wrong places, like if you start fast and go slow, instead of slow to fast, if you start fast and go slow, you'll get a tailing loop. Very quick little speed up and stop over a very short period of time, pop right there, you get a very tight loop. I'm making that about as tight as you can make a loop and still have it be practical. But very, very little short speed up and stop period. If I want a little wider loop, I just accelerate over a little bit longer period of time. And if I want a wide loop, I accelerate or power, call it what you want, over a longer period of time during the casting stroke. If you power it from here to here like this, power it all the way through the stroke, you can see your loop is completely blown out. And you see this on people's back casts a lot because they snatch the rod back. Instead of stroking the rod back, they snatch it back and get a big wide loop back here and then try to fix it on the forward cast. So power all the way through, big blown out loop. Power right at the very end, we get a nice tight loop. Now, let's talk about this tailing loop thing. Do we ever intentionally want to shoot a tailing loop? Probably not, except when we're teaching. We have to show people, what a tailing loop looks like and what causes it. One of the causes of tailing loops is snapping the power from the back. And I don't care who says that it isn't, it is. And I see more beginners trying to snap the power like that and getting a tailing loop. Now, there's other reasons you can get a tailing loop. If you push your hand ahead like this, that will give you a tailing loop. Or if you stop the rod real high, that will generally result in a tailing loop. So there are several causes. They all result in this little problem right here, the fly wrapped around the end of our loop connector or somewhere else on the fly line. And remember, this is lost fishing time that we're dealing with here. Every time we got to stop and undo this, we've missed an opportunity to catch a fish. So the tailing loop, if you're having trouble out on the river, and if you're not pushing your hand ahead like this, and you're still getting tailing loops, chances are you're getting the power on a little bit early. So get the rod tip through 12 o'clock. The rod tip, remember, not the butt, because the tip is lagging because it's loaded and it's bent back like this. So if you get the rod tip through the vertical, if you're casting in the vertical, or get it up into here somewhere before you put the power on, you probably won't get a tailing loop. So there's the rod forward. You see where the rod is? Power goes right there. Power. Power. Now if I start powering a little bit earlier, power, that loop is starting to tail, power, there it is. Now if I put the power on from the back, there's the worst of the tailing loops. So just think about getting the power on at the very end of the casting stroke, right there, and you will not get a tailing loop. Although it is possible to practice roll cast mechanics on the grass, the results aren't often very good. It's much better to work roll casting, on the water, because what causes the rod to load is the resistance of the line on the water. The roll cast, remember, is just, think of it as a front half of a normal cast. Position your hand in the back cast position. Line should be outside of the rod tip with the line still in the water and stopped. And then we make a normal forward cast. You may find in the roll cast that it requires a little more power than a normal forward cast. Again, pull her back, position the rod in the back cast position, line outside the rod tip, line stopped, normal forward cast. It's very important that the power go on at the end of the stroke, just like our regular cast. If you put the power on all the way through the stroke, you get a big high loop like that often ends up falling in a pile, just like that. And so if you're seeing that, don't power all the way through the stroke like that, but put the power on at the end, just like our regular cast. If you want the fly, if you're dry fly fishing with a roll cast, and you want the fly to come out of the water, just stop the rod a little higher, like that. If the wind's blowing and you want to roll it across the water, just run the rod down a little lower before you make your cast. You see what happens there is that run the rod tip down lower before we put the power on, and the line will roll right across the water for you. I'd like to talk now about shooting line. One of the mistakes that beginning fly fishermen make is that they try to carry too much line in the air. It's better to carry 20 feet and shoot 5 than it is to carry 25. Or in the extreme, try to carry 40 feet instead of carrying 35 feet and shooting 5 feet. So what I mean by that is we're going to shoot line on our forward cast. So I've taken it underneath my stripping finger. I now have it in my left hand, which is my control hand. And to shoot line, all we do is when we make our forward stop, we release this fly line. And you see it went right out. Now, you notice I didn't drop the line. You do not want to drop your fly line. You don't want to ever give up control of your fly line. So when you make your forward stop, you can either make your hand into an O like that, or open your fingers and let it run across your fingers like this, but never give it up, because at the end of the cast, the first thing you have to do is take the line from this hand and put it back underneath your stripping finger. So this is how we control our drift. This is also how we control fish initially. So when we're fishing, the line has to be underneath our stripping finger. When we're casting or getting ready to shoot line, it can be in our left hand. There's my little O right back under my stripping finger. The most important thing on shooting line is that you release the moment you make your forward stop. If you release early, the cast will collapse. If you release late, the line will not go out. Because at the moment you make your stop, the loop that's coming off the end of the rod has the maximum amount of energy. If you release early, the rod unloads. So remember, right when you make your forward stop, stop and release. Now let's do another practice session where we incorporate shooting line and false casting. The basic building block is still your pickup and lay down drill, but we're going to get one false cast in there and we're going to shoot line at the end of the second cast. So remember our basic pickup and lay down drill, about 25 feet of line, but this time we're going to have the line not under our stripping finger, but in our left hand. We're going to start with the rod tip down, no slack, line in your left hand, lift, back cast, forward cast, release and shoot, line under your stripping finger, right back down at the ground. Strip it back so that the line touches the ground. You notice I'm stripping from below my stripping finger or behind it, depending on your point of view. Line in your left hand, rod tip down, no slack, lift, back cast, forward cast, release, shoot, line back under your stripping finger, rod tip right back down at the ground. Now it's important when you're doing your practice sessions that you stick to 25 feet. You really should mark your line so you know where 25 feet is. Measure it, mark it, because the tendency when we're practicing is to start working a longer and longer and longer line. When you're trying to build muscle memory, you got to repeat the same cast over and over and over again. So stick to your 25 feet, maybe 30 feet at the most. 25 to 30 feet is where you want to do your practice sessions. When you're out on the stream and it gets a little quiet, you know, fish aren't cooperating, there's an opportunity to work on your casting on the water. Particularly when you're fishing upstream like this, you can really see the principle like in the pickup and lay down drill where you don't want any slack underneath the rod tip, because if you have a bunch of slack that catches up with you, it's very hard to pick it up and make a good initial back cast. So really work on those basic pickup and lay down drills, line under your stripping finger like I just did there, and really work on those, always work on those basics. You want this left hand, putting it under your stripping finger, to be an automatic, you know, just an automatic reaction. Every cast. Watch, here we go, we just boom, stop, shoot, immediately under my stripping finger, and I'm ready to set the hook. The other thing I'm doing right here is because I've got trees behind me, directly behind me, I can't cast in the vertical, so that's why I'm casting down here to the side. So when you're doing your pickup and lay down drill, you want to practice it not only from the vertical, but from different angles. You know, over your left shoulder, over your right shoulder, way down low at 90 degrees. You can see with each of these casts, all the principles are in place here. I'm stroking the rod slow to fast, slow to fast, slow to fast, slow to fast. I'm working a fairly long line now, probably at about 30 feet or 35 feet, so my stroke is quite a bit longer. My pause is quite a bit longer. But most importantly, I'm running my hand in one plane so that my fly turns directly over out in front. Here's our cast, exercising all the principles. Stroke length appropriate for the length of line, pause length appropriate for the length of cast, moving my hand in a straight line, one plane, and I'm also moving the rod slow to fast, slow to fast, slow to fast. And then the arm mechanics, you notice that my elbow is riding freely, comes up a little bit, back down, up, back down. My forearm is moving back and forth a little bit, and the rest of the range of motion is being provided by a slight opening and closing of my wrist. And notice that wrist motion stops in conjunction with the arm motion. Shoot some line. There you go. Whoa! A jumper. Not that big, but he's sure full of himself. Thank you, my friend. As I was saying earlier, I never get tired of my fly fishing. And one of the things that makes it enjoyable for me is good casting. The whole purpose of this video was to help you become a better caster so you can enjoy your fly fishing more. So remember those principles, get out there and practice, and then get out there and enjoy your fly fishing, because I certainly do.